at their origins. Remember that the Reformation was meant to correct flaws in the Christian faith, and especially to do away with Roman Catholic practices such as indulgences. Protestantism, however, was rigidly dogmatic on the divinity of Jesus Christ and the centrality of the Trinity. Part of our UU heritage comes from the explosive effect that Michael Servetus had upon the Reformers and Catholics alike when he wrote his book on the errors of the Trinity. He was ultimately executed, not by the Inquisition, but by John Calvin, who felt that his Reformation empire building was threatened by the audacity of this young man pointing out that the doctrine of the Trinity is not actually in the Bible anywhere. Far away from the power centers of Rome and Germany and Geneva, Transylvania and other Eastern European countries like Poland and Lithuania became the places where Unitarian thought and theology thrived in a climate of freedom and tolerance. This was in part made possible, and I'll speak more about this next week, by the Ottoman Empire. Remember how close at that time Islam was geographically to taking over Europe. This was such a chaotic time because you may also know that in the century before the Edict of Torda, 1492 is not just famous because Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but because the Kingdom of Spain ejected Jews and later Muslims from its territory. The tolerance in Eastern Europe is in sharp contrast to Western Europe, where forced baptisms and conversions came before more violent methods of the Inquisition and the imposition of laws of blood purity. Some historians claim that this linkage of religion and racial purity, recognizing a person as Christian only when they have a direct bloodline connection to past generations of Christians, is the root of anti-Semitism, which is prejudice against Jews on account of their racial identity, as opposed to anti-Judaism based on religious identity. But many Jews undercover in Spain as conversos, people who had converted, were in demand as the interest in biblical studies grew as a result of the Reformation's aim to make access to the Bible more widespread. And so people like Servetus learned about things like the lack of reference to the Trinity in Scripture. And anti-Trinitarian sentiment rose up again, centuries after the Arian controversy in the early church. Another change inspired at this time was to give the Jewish scriptures back their own integrity as sacred texts, and not just treating them as prophetic writings whose only value is in pointing to the revelation of Jesus as Savior of the world. After Servetus was executed, one of his most ardent apologists was Giorgio Biandrata, who came to Eastern Europe and dominated religious debates of the time. In 1562, Ritchie writes, Biandrata moderated a debate for a Reformed Church synod, and he asked that they not use any theological language that was not biblically based. And those who were present agreed. And that meant that the Trinity was not allowed to be referred to. And so the anti-Trinitarians won the debate. What's important for this morning is the influence Biandrata had on Reformed churches of that region. They were interested and engaged in dialogue with Judaism, attempting, as Ritchie says, to return to the earliest form of Christianity before it had been contaminated by imperial concerns, church hierarchy, and later additions to the creed. They were interested in rediscovering and incorporating aspects of Jewish religious practice. Why? Because those would have been Jesus's own practices and beliefs. So some anti-Trinitarians became known as Judaizers, who wanted to make the faith tradition more into the image of Judaism. An unfortunate twist in the ever-evolving nature of anti-Trinitarian thought came when the king behind the Edict of Torda, John Sigismund, died in a somewhat suspicious hunting accident in 1571. And the royal court's tolerance of Unitarianism was no longer certain. And the next year, the new king announced that it would only remain a legal religion if it ceased from introducing any further theological innovation. Imagine that, Unitarians not being able to innovate. So when Francis David began to argue publicly for the Unitarian Church to stop addressing prayers to Jesus, this was one innovation too far for Biandrata, because he was concerned that the Unitarian Church needed to survive, and he, like Calvin, was afraid of too much extremism. So he and David held a debate in 1578, but substantial weight was thrown behind David's argument, and some other Unitarians then began to insist that Saturday be declared the day for the Sabbath for worship, and that Jewish dietary laws be followed by Unitarians. In a move ironically reminiscent of Calvin arresting one of his own extreme reformers, Biandrata used his influence with the government to have David arrested. And David became ill and was denied medical treatment, and so he died in prison. Biandrata then took action against other Unitarian ministers, and the persecution and expulsions caused ripples in Poland, where many Unitarians then withdrew from dialogue with the Jewish community, and anti-Semitism also followed in Lithuania. In contrast to the Judaizers, other Unitarians emphasized reason, along with a close and personal reading of the Bible, as the way to understand true religion. And that form of Unitarianism was championed by Faustus Socinus. J. Solomon offers an example of how Socinus fiercely protected anti-Trinitarianism from innovation. He challenged a Unitarian named Jacob Paleologus, who tried to discern the supremacy of Unitarian doctrines directly from the scriptures. And he understood Unitarianism, particularly as it had appeared in the Transylvania and Lithuanian manifestations, as a potential bridge to other religions that constituted God's people, the people of Abraham, in his view, the Jews and the Muslims. And Paleologus posited that the ancient Jews were the people of God and that their descendants were capable of receiving salvation for their part in the true one God heritage. And so Jews from Moses' time were those who had rejected Jesus. Those who had accepted him were designated the Christians of the Jewish race, according to Paleologus. And Christian Turks was a term that was used to identify Muslims, also a people of God, because of their recognition of Jesus' divine mission. For Faustus Socinus, such notions were unacceptable and heretical, and were a perfect example of anti-Trinitarianism gone too far. And so he denounced Paleologus for his blasphemous statements. And although Paleologus did not adopt Jewish practices, as some anti-Trinitarians had done in Transylvania and Lithuania, Socinus still accused him of being a Jew, thus making Socinus the Polish equivalent of Biandrata. There's not going to be a quiz on all of these terms. It gets really complicated. And I'll throw one more in for you. The theological argument of adorationism, which was also employed against those who wished to see more Jewish influence in Unitarianism. Adorationism said that Jesus was born human, but had been elevated to a kind of divinity through God's adoption of him as his son, and so Jesus properly was a subject of adoration or worship. The Unitarians who followed Francis David, who were thrown out of the Unitarian Church, many of them became what was known as Sabbatarians, who did in fact adopt many Jewish practices in their own faith communities. Other Unitarians kept their identification as Unitarian but followed Jewish practices so openly that a Jesuit writing in 1583 observed that most Unitarian ministers in eastern Transylvania did not eat pork. One Sabbatarian group that withdrew from the Unitarian Church in eastern Hungary, and then as the borders shifted, that became Romania, that group is known as the Szekely Jews. Over the centuries, these Unitarians came to take on an exclusively Jewish identity and lived in a small village until it was flooded in 1989 by a dam project that accomplished the Romanian President Ceausescu's goal of erasing Hungarian ethnicity. And then there is the strange case of English Unitarianism and its engagement with Judaism. I'm really so excited to have learned something about this. It emerged in the late 18th century through the leadership of Theophilus Lindsay and Joseph Priestley. These were two Unitarian ministers, one in London, one in Leeds, who were examples of Unitarians who connected themselves intimately to the Jewish heritage and identified intensely with the Jewish people as the proper worshipers of the one true God. As a group that exhibited these patterns of behavior, J. Solomon writes, yet still held firmly to the conviction that they were Christians, the religious identity of the Unitarians in the last quarter of the 18th century illuminates the difficulty of coming up with a concrete definition of both the terms Christian and Jew, and emphasizes the fluidity of religion at the time. There was a tension between orthodoxy and tolerance, but it wasn't clear where one ended and one began. The English religious landscape at that time was not terribly tolerant, and those who did not toe the official Anglican line were known as dissenters or nonconformists. But they were mainly subject to social segregation and legal penalties, unlike the Unitarians on the mainland. Solomon writes that nonconformists banned from institutions like Oxford and Cambridge that didn't allow dissent, in order to teach themselves and their children not only theology, but science, mathematics, language, and rhetoric, educated their children in their own dissenting academies. With reason emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries as the means by which nature and the universe were to be understood, those students of dissenting academies learned about the Bible and religion in a similar way to the secular subjects. So in other words, in the way of reason. Their approach to the Bible rationally and scientifically involved the study of both the Old and New Testaments in their original tongues. And in addition to Greek, dissenting students learned Hebrew as part of their nonconformist biblical education. So Hebrew, Jewish history, and Semitic studies became really important components of the nonconformist education. And eventually, the 17th and especially the 18th centuries were awash with scholars who were well-versed in the Old Testament and its language and its laws. However, so interestingly, there was a lack of Jewish presence in England because of centuries before a series of violent attacks on Jewish communities. And there were very few Jews living there for 3 centuries until their unofficial acceptance back into the country in the mid-17th century. So the Anglican opponents of nonconformists berated other English anti-Trinitarians for corrupting Orthodox Christianity and adopting the beliefs of the Jews. But here comes, in 1774, the Reverend Theophilus Lindsay, who founded the first Unitarian church at the Essex Street Chapel in London. He had been an Anglican minister who had become increasingly unhappy with his faith, and in the early 1770s resigned his position as parish priest in Catterick, a small Yorkshire village. His subsequent writings gave his vision of himself among a long line of nonconformists, including Servetus, but also Socinus. His problem, primarily with the doctrine of the Trinity, was not simply that it required the offering of prayers to beings other than the one true God, but that it also destroyed God's unity. And so, in defining the Unitarian position, Lindsay centered his concept of Christianity upon a belief of God's oneness. And he also argued that Muslims, as well as Jews, were Unitarian in sympathies, and that Muslims were also uninterested in the potential salvation of Christianity because they were unable to reconcile the belief in a 3-part God. Now, Unitarian Joseph Priestley was a scientist who also had a passion for the study of theology, religion, and history. And many people around him at the time worried that he would add to the social instability in England through his growing involvement with controversial issues pertaining to political and liberal and religious liberty, like suffrage and like slavery. Indeed, the chaos that followed the French Revolution of 1789 triggered the eruption of conservative sentiments among the English masses. And in 1791, Solomon writes, a mob rose against Priestley. They destroyed his home and all his scientific lab work in Birmingham, where he lived. So he was fearing for the life of his family and his life, and he moved to London, where he was able to associate regularly with his close friend and religious ally, Theophilus Lindsay, and engage in his work as scientist, minister, teacher, and author. And eventually, of course, Priestley moved to Philadelphia and helped to found the church in Philadelphia. But Priestley was convinced that the revolutionary climate was an indication of the return of Jesus Christ and that the end of the world was close at hand. I suppose if you knew anything about the French Revolution, you might be afraid that the end of the world was at hand. So he reached out to Jews in order to convert them to Christianity, but he did it in the nicest possible way. No inquisition for him. Based on prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures, Priestley said that not only did the gospel have to be spread to all the corners of the earth, but the Jews had to be converted to Christianity. And furthermore, they had to be restored to their homeland of ancient Judea before the end of the world could happen. So Priestley set out to convince Jews to convert using reason, saying that the previous Christian misinterpretations of the Bible was now not a problem because he could explain the Bible in a rational manner. Priestley attacked the absurdity of Catholic doctrine, which he felt had not only resulted in centuries of oppression, but had also polluted and spread the gospel under idolatrous pretenses. Priestley really earnestly believed that it was his responsibility to work toward fulfilling the prophecies that would usher in the millennium, and that we all needed to make efforts to be moral and upright individuals and thereby set an example for all, and that could bring about an earthly paradise. Solomon says that every word Priestley wrote must be understood within the context of a Unitarian believing that he could offer the Jews a Christianity that was not only purged of corruptions, finally in possession of the truth, and already closer to the Jewish religion and therefore easier to adopt theologically. According to Priestley, not only did the Jews worship God properly, but he too loved their same God and worshiped him in a practically identical manner. He said that because of the Jews, the Unitarian doctrine had been preserved, and so he was an inheritor of this tradition of divine worship. He saw a lot of similarities between his religion and Judaism. Not surprisingly, Orthodox Christians set about to undermine the credibility of the Unitarians who sought to return Christianity to its original state. They said that since the Unitarians had forsaken the truth of the Trinity, they were enemies to Christianity and the preservation of orthodoxy. Excuse me. Eventually, the Unitarians shifted theologically closer to Judaism as what they thought was a move toward reclaiming Christian truth. These two men, Lindsay and Priestley, were at the forefront of this movement. They took pride in their relationship to Judaism, and they identified intensely with the Jewish people and the Jewish religion. The borders were fluid until Orthodox Christians began to draw the line to say that Unitarianism was not Christian. But the Unitarian understanding that Judaism and Christianity do not dwell in separate spheres but exist along a great continuum with an infinite amount of possible identities in between the poles has contributed, Ritchie says, to the progressive or universal contemporary appreciation of liberal religion. Susan Ritchie says that with the ease with which our society on the whole deals with multi-religiosity might allow us to escape our obsession with and neurosis around identity. She asks us to understand that religion is not a container of truths, but a matrix of relationships. And if religion is relationship, then it is inherently multi-religious. I find all this fascinating, as you can tell, partly because I have been to some of the places where these debates and creative theologizing took place, but mostly because I like to know where my faith comes from. I love the fact that people felt empowered to debate, write, and discuss issues of theology with bravery. We are, and Unitarian Universalism is all the richer for that. So now we will tackle our song that it comes from the Transylvanian tradition.